live group tutorial. This is GCSE English with our English tutor Vicki, and this is on paper 1 question 3 part 1. So lots of you have joined us for these sessions before, so welcome back if so. If this is your first time joining us for a tutorial, welcome. I'll just quickly explain how this will work. This will be a 1 hour session, so we'll be finishing at 12 at midday, and all the way through, please feel free to pop any questions you might have for Vicki in the chat or the Q&A function, or any questions you may have for me about the My Tutor online school. I'm Tilly, I work at My Tutor, so just let us know if you have any questions. So just wait a couple of moments for a few more people to join. This was originally going to be a session yesterday, but as lots of you know, this was moved to today. We'll still be making sure that we fit in everything we had planned for this week, so you guys don't miss out on any content. So just keep an eye on your emails to let you know when the extra session will be put in. Brilliant. Okay, looks like lots of people have joined us, so that's fantastic. As usual, Vicki will go through all the content, and then we'll have some time if you have any questions at the end to run through those. So Vicki, if you're all ready, then let's kick off.
Fab. Thank you. Right, good morning everybody. So we're moving on from question 2 that we were looking at last week, which was language devices and features, and now we are moving on to look at structural features. So in terms of paper 1 question 3, what it asks you to do, how it's different. So first off, we look at the entire source. So with paper 2, we just had sort of a small chunky paragraph to look at. This we're looking at the entire thing. So question always stays the same. So how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? And the bullet points pretty much stay the same. So what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes as a source develops, and structural features that interest you. So again, 3 bullet points, very similar to question 2. So this is also an 8 marker, and it's also looking at assessment objective 2, what you're being assessed as. So it's very, very similar to question 2. In terms of structure, length, it all is very, very similar. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be sharing with you over the next week in terms of how I've structured the sessions and how we're going to approach things is quite similar, although we are looking at a different set of features. So if some of it does look familiar, it's because it is very, very similar in terms of what we need to be doing. It's just looking at a different set of features. So structural features then, so the general purpose of them is to put things in a particular order for the reader, and that's done deliberately to interest the reader in some way. Now, that's a very generic thing. So if it actually comes to the exam and you write something along the lines of this makes the reader want to read on, or this makes the reader interested in the story, you won't be awarded any marks for that, simply because it's far too general. Yeah, we know, because when you are writing, you want people to read on and you want them to be interested. That's just the generic fact of why you write something. So we need to think about why they are being done and how and why it's being structured in that way. So structural features then, so this is a really rubbish little mnemonic that I use. It's a whole load of letters that didn't fit particularly well together, so I went for stop fez. So this was the best I could do with what I had. So I'm going to run through all of these features today, and then we'll see how we go, and I'm going to try and apply it to a text, so hopefully we'll get through all of it. So we've got start, setting, transitions, omniscient narrator, perspective, flashback or forwards, focus, ending, and zoom in and out. So those are a variety of structural features. They're not, this isn't a definitive list. There are others as well. Can you shout out any others to me that you can think of? Just give you a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah, can be applied to our GCSE. In terms of most exam boards, what you are being, the content that you're being assessed on is quite similar. So in terms of terminology, you absolutely can apply it. That's a question for Tilly to answer at the end, I'm not sure on. Cyclical structure, yeah, lovely. So paper 1 question 3 is quite often the question on paper 1 which students struggle with. So this is because it's, yeah, so what some of you have come up with is that you've come up with language devices. So a semantic field would be a language device. So what tends to happen is that students tend to write the same thing for question 2 as they did question 3, and they tend to talk about language devices and features instead of structural features. So this week I'm going to be really hammering into you the difference between the two and making it clear to you what that difference is. So some other ones, let's just see what's coming up. Tone, yeah, tone is one. Foreshadowing, yeah, you could talk about that one. Figurative language would come under question 2. So figurative language is things like personification, metaphors, similes, anything along those lines. So that would be language devices. Right, so someone came up with cyclical structure, that was lovely. Someone came up with tone, repetition, characterization, pace, tension. Now, some of you I'm sure will be saying, well, repetition, we looked at that last week in question 2. I'm going to explain the difference to you. So repetition is a little bit of a tricky one, but we will talk about them. Okay, so I'm going to go through, define them, give you some examples, and hopefully we'll clear up anything that you're not sure of that I've mentioned so far. So start and ending, they're pretty self-explanatory. I don't need to tell you sort of what a start and what an ending is. I'm sure you all know. So the questions that we could ask when we're actually looking at start and ending is, are they linked? Is there something happening between those 2 points that's sort of really quite explosive, really interesting? Is the focus the same? So if the focus is the same, then perhaps have we got a cyclical structure? So yeah, although what your bullet points, you're being asked to look at the focus at the start, at the beginning, you could also link that further to the focus changing as the source develops. So you could think about how those 2 things link, and thinking about that in a sophisticated way will get you big marks. Right, transitions. So transitions refers to movements in the text, so moving from one paragraph to another. So I've given you an example here. So this is from Animal Farm, so some of you might be studying this as one of your set text. So these 2 disliked each other so much that it was difficult to come to any agreement, even in defence of their own interests. That's the end of one paragraph. We move on to the next paragraph. Nevertheless, they were both thoroughly frightened by the rebellion on Animal Farm. So changing a little bit, there's a little bit of a shift. So in terms of transitions, have you got a clear transition? Is there a link between 2 paragraphs? Well, for this one, yes, there is a link. So first we're sort of stating what the problem is, and then we're saying why that is a problem in terms of this animal farm. Has the next paragraph been set up by the preceding paragraph? So yes, we can see that in this one. If the transition isn't smooth, why is that? So what could we postulate for the reason for that being? So nevertheless, there I have labelled, it's hiding behind the little blue button, as a discourse marker. So some of you might have come across discourse markers. I think they are quite helpful in helping you identify transitions. So they're a good little piece of terminology to know, although it is mainly something that starts to crop up when you get to A level. So I do think it is a good thing to know about. So just quickly tell you what a discourse marker is. So these are words that signify that we're moving on. So I've given you some examples for written and speech. So these are things that we do automatically without really realising that we do it. So I've given you some examples for written. These are sort of a little more exciting, a little bit more interesting, sophisticated, because speech goes so quickly that we don't necessarily use complex words in everyday conversation. So one that I use quite often is, so right now we're going to do this. So you'll probably find that your teachers use quite a lot of these when perhaps you're off in a paired activity or group activity and you're chatting, you're making quite a lot of noise. You'll probably find that your teachers tend to raise their voice and say one of these things to start off their what they are going to say to you as their instructions. So they're always good to see if a text is moving on, if you can identify those. Now, omniscient narrator. So this is something which you probably won't see very often. So omniscient narrators. So for those of you who have done RE, I'm sure you'll know what omniscient is. So omni means all in Latin, and scio means knowing in Latin, to know or to learn. So if we add those two together, omniscient, we get all-knowing. So it's a narrator that is all-knowing, so knows everything that's going on in the story. And what is useful to know, which helps you sort of in terms of clues in working out whether they are omniscient or not, there's probably going to be first person in the text, and it's probably going to be in past tense, because in order to know everything that's going to happen, it's probably going to be sort of reflective in some way. So let's just have a look at the chat, see. Omnipotent isn't quite the same. So omnipotent means all powerful. So you could have an omnipotent narrator, but it's not something that you really need to worry about. I think it would be very rare for you to have an omnipotent narrator. So I imagine that you've thought of that in terms of the characteristics of God. So omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, which means all loving. There's another one as well, but I can't think what it is. So yeah, don't worry about them too much, just worry about omniscient narrator. So in terms of them, identifying which person is which, I'm sure lots of you know this. So first person, we're looking for I or me or we or us. Third person, he, she, it or they or them, or actually just using their names. So that's how we identify persons. So my example for omniscient narrator then. So I've chosen Blood Brothers, which is another set text. I'm sure some of you are studying this. So this is a quotation from the start of the play, in which basically the narrator tells us the entire plot of the show. It's a massive spoiler. So he starts off with them being born, and then them dying, and tells us exactly what's going to go on. We're going to start with them being born, and then we're going to end with them dead on the stage. So that's an example of an omniscient narrator. Right, perspective. So this is where a story is taken from a certain person's viewpoint. So again, you'll usually only ever have first or third person. It's very, very rare to have a second person text, because it's quite difficult to keep up. So I've given you a couple of examples of first person there. So Moby Dick, written in first person, and Great Gatsby as well. So with first person, we're usually going to probably have some bias towards something. So if any of you have read The Great Gatsby, it's an A-level text now, I did it for GCSE. You'll know that the narrator, Nick Carraway, gives you his opinions and ideas, thoughts on the characters in the play, and sort of manipulates our ideas about them, because we're reading his opinion as fact, essentially. So that's a good one to keep an eye out for. So different types of third person there. So I've got omniscient, over the shoulder, and free and direct. So omniscient, I've already explained to you. So I've also put Lord of the Flies down there and Little Women as some examples. Over the Shoulder, so Harry Potter, Christmas Carol, and To Kill a Mockingbird. So To Kill a Mockingbird is, oh, that says To Kill and a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is written predominantly in first person by Scout, but there is some third person in there as well, looking over the shoulder of Scout. So, for example, with Harry Potter, we are looking over the shoulder of Harry and we're sort of following him as a shadow. We make the same mistakes that he does. The same with Scrooge, we're sort of looking over Scrooge's shoulder from Scrooge's perspective. We get to know him very well. Free indirect is basically when you have someone who's just reporting the facts to you, isn't giving you an opinion, and it's just very, very straightforward. So I've given you examples there of Animal Farm, Frankenstein. There are some letters in Frankenstein, and which are written in first person, and The Sign of Four, which is, all three of those are set text. So is Christmas Carol, so is Lord of the Flies, and Blood Brothers. So I'm hoping one of those you will be looking at. I've tried to cover something. Yes, this is English language. Would an unreliable narrator be related to this topic? Yeah, absolutely. So you could, that's perspective. So you could talk about the perspective and then you could talk about the unreliability of it. Absolutely. Very good question. This is English language. Yeah, I am choosing some example text from English literature and things you were studying in the hope that there is something for everyone that you have read and that you know a little bit about, so you know that that is an example of one of the things I'm talking about. I'm sort of edging my bets, really, that you will be familiar with one of these texts as an example. Right, so talked about this over the shoulder now. So this comes back very nicely to the unreliability. So are we looking over the shoulder of the protagonist? So that's the good main character or the antagonist. Therefore, do we have a biased picture, biased story? If so, why? Are we making the same mistakes? So it's definitely something to consider. And then free direct there, which comments on a variety of people, characters, themes, ideas, and is non-biased, basically. Right, excuse me, let's take a quick drink. So, flashback and flash forward. So I imagine this is pretty straightforward to you as well. So this is where we either move forwards or backwards in time within the text. It's much more common to have a flashback. So why, I've given you some reasons as to why that might be. So Christmas Carol then, so we have a flashback right at the start to when Marley is dead, which is way before the text actually starts. So that gives us background information, it gives us context. Stave 1 is called Marley's Ghost. So in order for us to understand who on earth Marley is and why is he appearing to tell Scrooge that he's a condemned man, essentially, if he continues, we need to know who Marley was in relation to Scrooge and why the importance of his death is so needed for the text that we're going for. So to distract the reader as well. So in Frankenstein, there's quite a lot of sort of tension building, and we sort of talk about something very dark in terms of what Frankenstein's monster has been up to and what on earth is going on. And then Shelley goes on and talks about something which is quite insignificant. So you're reading really quickly to find out what on earth this monster has done, because you're getting some back information as to what on earth caused Frankenstein to create the monster. So it's a very clever way to do it. So to make the reader feel disorientated, so this is, I've given the example for we need to talk about Kevin. So if you've read the book or if you've seen the film is really difficult to follow because it flashes back and forwards all over the place. And it's very difficult to understand why that is and understand what on earth is going on. So the reason for that particular book is because Kevin has some severe mental health issues, and it's trying to emulate why on earth and he has done the deeds that he's done, and perhaps how his own mind is working in terms of it being sort of all over the place. And then there's to present a certain mindset as well. So To Kill a Mockingbird and sort of Scout. So to start off with, right at the beginning, she flashes back to Jem breaking his arm, which seems completely unnecessary, but that unravels into something else. So those are a few examples. Zooming in again and out, pretty straightforward. So either looking at a specific detail or looking at the big picture. Don't need to go into too much detail about that one. Now, repetition. So this is where you need to be careful. So the first one I've given you an example of, which is the example I gave you Wednesday a couple of weeks ago, which I've taken from Bayonet Charge. So the repetition of the word raw. So in terms of this one, we would need the repetition of the word raw to appear in several paragraphs for it to make sense as a structural feature. If it's repeated like this, then that is not a structural feature, that is a language device. So it needs to be dotted around a few paragraphs essentially, or just to appear a couple of times in separate paragraphs. So I can't remember what I'm going to look over with you. I think I'm definitely going to look at Catcher in the Rye. Let me just double check what I've got planned. So definitely doing Catcher in the Rye with you. And so that's got some repetition in it, and 1984 as well has some repetition in it. So we will explore this a little further in terms of what on earth that means in terms of structural features, and why is a structural feature in instead of a language device. The other one is the repetition of an idea. So if you've ever read the start of Harry Potter, it starts with Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were perfectly normal, thank you very much. And then it repeatedly goes through the idea that they're incredibly normal, and then the writer gives a little bit of evidence for why they're not normal. So there's this secret sister who is married to this layabout, which is referring to Lily and James Potter, and they have a son called Harry, and this terrible secret of those people that they're not in contact with. So that could be repetition in terms of an idea. Characterization, so this is details that we learn about a certain character, so personality, appearance, background information, or how they live their day-to-day lives. Pretty straightforward one. Nice one that you can usually roll into one of those other bullet points. Cyclical structure. So again, I've given you the example of Blood Brothers. So this is where in this instance the play starts and ends at the same point. So as you can see there, we've got the twins are dead. So it starts with people dead on the stage. Then the twins are born and separated. So it goes all the way back, flashback to the Mrs. Johnston being pregnant with them, then being born and separated. Then we flash forward to them at 7. Then we flash forward to them at 14. Then we flash forward to them as adults, and then that goes through to them both being dead on the stage. So it starts and ends at the same point. Tone and mood. So this is where we sort of get a particular emotion. So for this one, I've chosen Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive. We're proud to say they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. So very no-nonsense approach. That's telling us also a little bit about Mr. and Mrs. Dursley and what we can expect from them as characters. And then tone, so we could talk about tension there. Why are we building to a climax in the text, and where is that going to take us? Pace, so how quickly or slowly a plot is revealed. So Dickens, at the start of Christmas Carol, starts off really quickly. So Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about it. Whereas To Kill a Mockingbird, the start of that is really quite slow and gentle, and it's sort of, why on earth are we talking about your brother breaking his arm? It doesn't seem particularly important or relevant. So when he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. It's an odd thing to start with. So that's quite slow paced. Right, let's see what questions you're throwing at me. So, right, so punctuation, does that count as structure? Well, no, don't write about punctuation, because that's something you could write about in sentence forms in question 2. In terms of what is coming up and are we doing English literature, so I think Frederica said that last Friday, I think, that's something that's being considered, but it's not sort of in place, at least with me anyway. Right, so yeah, Our Day Out, yeah, so that's another Willie Russell play. Yeah, use the speech, direct or indirect. Yeah, you could definitely look at that as a part of structure. Yeah, so the text I'm going to be looking at generally has a lot of these features in. So what I'll do is I'm going to run through the rest of what I've got, and then we'll come back to things that you want me to go back over. So this is the question again. So you will be told where this text is taken in relation to the novel, the short story, novella, whatever you'll be told. So this is from the beginning. So context then. So I think, was it Friday we looked at The Lovely Bones, or Thursday, I can't remember. We looked at it at the end of last week. So same text, different extract. So this is your context. So extract is taken from the novel by Alice Sebold, written in 2002. It's set in the 1970s and follows the story of Susie and her family after Susie has been murdered. So always take away the important bits of information there, and what can we say about it? So let's go through. So I've got 4 paragraphs to look at today, so you usually probably be given a bit more than 4 paragraphs to look at. But for the purposes of getting through everything, I've just chosen 4 to look at. So my name was Salmon. Like the fish, first name Susie. So immediately we know what her name is. So we're already building on characterization, because we're learning something about her as a person. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6, 1973. Again, we're learning more about her, so this is characterization. In newspaper photos of missing girls from the 70s, most look like me. White girls with mousy brown hair. So this is mainly sort of contextual information, and what we already know so far is she's using past tense, so we know that it's reflective. And it's in first person. So almost already we've got absolutely masses that we could talk about. This was before kids of all races and genders started appearing on milk cartons or in the Daily Mail. It was still back when people believed things like that didn't happen. Now, I think this is really interesting. So why do you think we are being told it in this way? This was before kids of all races and genders starting appearing on milk cartons. Why do you think the writer chooses to do that? I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer that. This is from The Lovely Bones. Build up a paradigm. Yeah, that's a lovely answer. Isn't the narrator omniscient? Yeah, she is. So it's sort of giving us a flavour that she knows more than perhaps we would expect her to, because let's face it, she's dead. She shouldn't be talking at all, should she? So it is setting up for being an omniscient narrator. Absolutely. However, we need probably a little more evidence for that already, because this could just sort of be a reflective ghost who's writing, 40 years in the future, and this effectively is a little bit of a flashback, isn't it? So what can we predict about the book from this paragraph then? So the third question I've got there. What are we going to expect to happen? Yeah, it's definitely reflecting a change, absolutely. Yeah, we're going to be told how she was murdered. So we sort of all, within the first short paragraph, we've already been told what the book's going to be about, and basically it's sort of a big spoiler. We're going to find out how Susie was murdered and what happened as a consequence of that. Absolutely cracking. Well done, guys. Okay, let's flick on to the next slide. Whoops. Right, so it's fallen off the bottom a little bit. Right, okay, so this is my what a good one looks like then, as an example of what we could write for the first bullet point. So what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning. Now, what I imagine I've done, let me just double check I have done it. Yeah, I've talked about other structural features in this as well. So I've rolled sort of 2 bullet points into one. So at the start of the extract, Seabold focuses our attention of Susie Salmon. That should be on. Terrible. My name was Salmon, like the fish, first name Susie. So I have embedded my quotations. By doing so, the writer immediately introduces us to the main character of the novel, as well as introducing us to the narrator. So I'm saying what the purpose, I think, of starting off like that is. The focus at the beginning of the text is instrumental in creating and developing the characterisation of Susie. So I'm talking about characterisation, which is a tick on other structural features. The writer creates tension at the end of the first paragraph by suggesting that something seriously wrong has happened to Susie. So it was still back then when people believed things like that didn't happen. So I'm talking about why, I'm talking about tone, I'm talking about mood, I'm talking about pace a little bit, I suppose. So, and then I'm then saying why I think this happens. So the further clues given, such as the mention of missing girls, makes the reader infer that we are going to find out how and what happened to Susie. Okay, so within that, I've already talked about characterisation, I've talked about tension, and I've talked about how that makes the reader feel and why the structural features have been used. So I've already ticked off absolutely masses in terms of getting me some marks there. So we've already ticked off the first bullet point, and we've also looked a little bit at the third bullet point. So let's move on and look at the rest. Let me just check. Yeah, it was her neighbour. Right, so focus of paragraph 2 then. So our second bullet point asks us how the focus shifts, how it changes throughout. So what I think is quite a nice way to think about this clearly is go through and write focus and then just a dash or a colon and just write 2 or 3 words next to each paragraph. Let me see if I've got an example of how I do it. So when I'm annotating a text, so I go through it and then I just write what the focus is right next to it. So it's very clear for me in terms of how things change, and then I can postulate why. So in my junior high yearbook, I had a quote from a Spanish poet my sister had turned me on to, Juan Ramon Jimenez, I think. It went like this: if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. I chose it both because it expressed my contempt for my structured surroundings, a la the classroom, and because not being some dopey quote from a rock group, I thought it marks me as literary. I was a member of the chess club and chem club and burned everything I tried to make in Mrs. Delminicho's home ec class. My favourite teacher was Mr. Bott, who taught biology and liked to animate the frogs and crawfish we had to dissect by making them dance in their wax pans. So how does this paragraph help us build a clearer picture of Susie, first of all, and what is the focus of the paragraph? Give you a couple of minutes to have a think about that. send me some ideas in the chat function. Yeah, so this is from the Lovely Bones again. Can you answer with a pearl? Is pearl a is that point evidence analysis reader link? And yeah, you can if you want to, but don't feel limited that you can't go off and do sort of more detailed analysis by it. Yeah, so what's the focus of this paragraph then? Give you 30 seconds to come up with some ideas. Yeah, so it makes her seem very innocent, normal. She seems to be quite intelligent, quite sort of clear, set in her ways, likes being a little bit edgy, but seems relatively academic. Yeah, so this is building on her characterization, most definitely. Yeah, and from that, she seems naive, intelligent, normal. From that, we know that she's been murdered. Therefore, we're going to feel a sense of sort of, I suppose, sadness in a sense that someone who seemed quite clean cut, normal, wasn't upsetting anybody has been killed. Lovely, right. So next paragraph then. So I wasn't killed by Mr. Bott, by the way. Don't think that every person you're going to meet here is suspect. That's the problem. You never know Mr. Bott came to my memorial. As, may I add, did most of the entire junior high school, I was never so popular and cried quite a bit. He had a sick kid, we all knew this, so when he laughed at his own jokes, which were rusty way before I had him, we laughed too, forcing it sometimes just to make him happy. His daughter died a year and a half after I did. She had leukemia, but I never saw her in my heaven. So this is more sort of the focus on the omniscient narrator here. So this is where we really find our evidence for her being omniscient. Okay, what's the focus on this paragraph? Why do you think Susie feels she has to say that she wasn't killed by Mr. Bott? And what is the tone of this paragraph? So answer any or all of those questions, I don't mind, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah, so it's definitely somber tone, a little bit sinister. Yeah, I think you could definitely say that. That's fine if you're a little confused. Tell me what you're confused about, and then I'll go over whatever you're confused about when we get to the Q&A. Yeah, it is quite comical, isn't it? It's very light-hearted for what she's talking about. Yeah, so I think she's probably, the writer here is predicting that we want to find out who the murderer is. That's the tension that's being built. That's why essentially we want to read on. We want to find out what on earth has happened to her. So I suppose our first thought would be it's more likely to be a man that's killed her. So the first man that she talks about, well, we think, oh, well, that's the one that killed her. And she's predicting that we're going to think that and then diffusing that idea. And by saying she knows that she wasn't killed by Mr. Bott, it's also telling us that she knows who did kill her. And there's a sense of omnisciency there as well. Good. Yeah, absolutely. So sense of leading the reader in a informed way. Absolutely. Yeah, so there's loads of omniscient narrator stuff going on here. What about transitions? What's the clear thing that's mentioned at the end of this paragraph? Who are we introduced to that we find out more information on? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Inspector calls omniscient narrator. Yeah. Well, I would say not necessarily narrator because it's a play, but Inspector Gould is omniscient. Absolutely. Yeah, so we're initially sort of, there's a little bit about Mr. Bott here, and then it goes into much more detail about who he was, why she liked him, that sort of thing. So a clear transition from that paragraph where we set up just say, look, here's a teacher that I liked, and then go on to say how that teacher affected her, what happened after her death. Absolutely, so there's a nice transition going on there. Right, fourth paragraph. My murderer was a man from our neighbourhood. My mother liked his border flowers and my father talked to him once about fertiliser. My murderer believed in old-fashioned things like eggshells and coffee grounds, which he said his own mother had used. My father came home smiling, make jokes about how the man's garden might be beautiful, but it would stink to high heaven once the heat wave hit. So, what's the focus? How does the paragraph create tension? Why is this revelation important to the reader, and how does this make the reader feel? So when you, the person that's asking where did I find the text about Susie Salmon, are you just asking what book it's from? If that's the case, The Lovely Bones, quite a popular book. Yeah, the focus is on the murderer, definitely. I think the neighbour was called Harvey, but remember that we can't talk about anything like that because we're not told about it. We can only talk about what's going on in the text that we've actually been given in front of us, so we can't talk about any sort of extra information that we know about. Yeah, and her parents never find out who her murderer is for sure. But again, we don't know that because we haven't got the rest of the book to read. Makes the reader feel shocked as they don't expect the murder. Yeah, it seems quite an odd thing to do, doesn't it? Sort of generally in most books, we don't find out who the murderer is until the end because that's how the tension is built. So this sort of flips it on its head, really, doesn't it? We're told who the murderer is straight away, or at least some beginning, sort of like an outline of him, essentially. Absolutely. Right. So what I think is quite a nice thing to do is go through checklist in terms of which of these things can we talk about. So start, we've talked about that, and we've looked at the waggle. Setting, is setting really talked about? It mentions her high school, but it doesn't really mention it in any great detail. And it mentions her neighbourhood, but again doesn't really give us any detail. So setting definitely isn't focused on. Transitions we've talked about, so we're moving from hi, I'm Susie, I've been killed. Here's a little bit of background information about me. Here's a teacher I really liked. Then we move on to the third one. Let's talk about this teacher that I really like, by the way, he's not my murderer. And then we move on to the fourth paragraph. He's not my murderer, but this guy is. So there's clear transitions in between each paragraph. Susie knows absolutely everything that's going on, so she's an omniscient narrator. Perspective, it's first person and it's from Susie's perspective. And we've already sort of postulated that she seems quite normal, naive. We know that she was 14 when she died, so she's probably still talking from a 14-year-old's mind. Flashbacks, so this is all quite reflective. So yeah, we could say that it's a flashback. Ending, it ends on us finding out who the murderer is, or at least be able to sort of create a stencil. Zooming in and out, so we definitely have zooming in and out in the sense that we start with an overview of hi, I've been murdered, then we move into zooming in a little bit more about her, who she is as a person, actually making her into a three-dimensional person instead of a person who's been murdered and just labelling it like that. We then zoom in on a particular character and how her death affected that character, and then we sort of zoom out a little bit again and talk about who the murderer was, but we don't really know that much about him yet. Tone, we've talked about, quite sombre, and also a little bit light-hearted in the sense that she seems to have gained some sense of, what could we say, she sort of accepted her death perhaps in the way that she's speaking about it. We don't have a cyclical structure because it doesn't start and end in the same place. Have we got repetition? I suppose we've got repetition of the idea of, oh, I've been murdered, I've been murdered, I've been murdered, and giving slightly different pieces of information as we go. Definitely tension being created because we want to find out who the murderer is, and there's definitely some characterisation because we find out more about Susie, more about Mr. Bott, and we're starting to learn about the murderer. Right, so in terms of which features are the most interesting to talk about, and can we link some of those together? So definitely we could link the focuses together. I think if you have got an omniscient narrator, I would definitely talk about it, and you could roll perspective into that one as well. And probably roll characterisation into it as well, because they're probably telling you something about themselves, and potentially I think perhaps talking about tension or flashbacks there as well. They're the most interesting ones. So this is what a good one looks like for you then. So I'll just double check what you guys have sent through to me. How does she find out, and why does she not tell her parents? Well, she doesn't tell her parents because she's dead, so she can't communicate with them. And she knows who her murderer is because she witnessed him murder her. Yeah, there's definitely a sense of supernatural. That's quite a nice one. Intrigue, yeah, in the sense that this murderer seems quite normal and blends into the background. Yeah, it's very reflective and basically a flashback. You're absolutely right. Okay, so let's have a look at this, what a good one looks like then. So this extract is written as a flashback in which Susie reflects back to the days surrounding her disappearance, choosing to focus on her biology teacher. So I've mentioned flashback and I've mentioned focus so far. I've embedded my quotation, I wasn't killed by Mr. Bott, by the way. This simple sentence at the start of the paragraph warns the audience away from Mr. Bott being a killer. So I have talked about a simple sentence, but I've literally just thrown it in there. I'm not going to analyse the simple sentence in sort of a language way. I've just thrown it in there. So I'm saying why it's there, not why it's effective in terms of it being a short, simple sentence. So it appears that Susie feels this is necessary as the reader is now, after finding out that she has been killed, searching for her killer. By creating this diversion, Sebald, so I'm using what I've been told in my context, Sebald builds tension in what has so far been a fast-paced introduction to the story. So I've talked about tension and I've talked about pace. Susie further demonstrates in this paragraph that she is an omniscient narrator, as she is able to recount pieces of information that she was not present for. So Mr. Bott came to my memorial, so she wouldn't have been there because she is dead now. She's talking as a spirit. Susie's ability to recount such information makes the reader trust her, as she becomes both reliable and credible. So I'm saying why it's important that those things are there, and I've thrown in masses and masses of terminology, but I've rolled them all together and made sure that I'm not just feature spotting. I'm saying why I know that and why it's important that those features are there. Right, so I'll just double check chat feature. Let's have a quick look. So this extract is from the beginning of The Lovely Bones. Have I got it near me? I'm not sure that I do. Oh, I do. So it's from this book here, The Lovely Bones. Nice, very, very clever book, but it is a bit depressing. So I'd read it if you're in a good mood, to be honest with you. So, fabulous. So let's just quickly move on. I think I've just got one more slide. So top tips then, which we're going to be going over during the week. So be specific, tell the examiner how and why structural features are being used. So if you just say, here's a structural feature being used, you don't get that many marks because you need to analyse it. Embed your quotations, use a variety of evidence to support your ideas. Try to link structural devices together because you can usually roll that third bullet point, any other structural features, into talking about the second or the first bullet point as well, so you can effectively kill two birds with one stone. And link the change of focus throughout the text with other structural devices, again, killing two birds with one stone. Right, questions then, please. So if you've got any questions about what is happening in terms of yesterday's session and what's going on with that, Tilly will answer that for you because I'm not sure. And if you've got any questions for me in terms of question 3, what we're going to go over for the next of the week, or just generally anything that you would like to ask me to go over again, shoot them at me now and I will go through them with you.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll just answer a couple of questions that got asked throughout, and then in the meantime, send over any extra questions for Vicki to go over. Do we do free French lessons? Not yet, but this is a subject that we're looking at. We're looking at adding languages potentially in the next few weeks, but don't have any particular details for you on that yet. So just watch this space and watch your emails for details of any added subjects. That also goes for people asking about other subjects like business, ICT, etc. So just watch this space for that. And thank you for your suggestions for other subjects. That's really useful. Let's have a look. A few people were asking throughout, and I know Vicki answered this a couple of times, but in case you missed that, these are English language, and yes, we are talking about adding some English literature tutorials for you. Obviously, the difficulty there is we want to make sure we're catering to as many people as possible, and there are a number of different texts that you're all studying. So before we launch those, we just want to make sure that we're catering to as many people as possible. So again, watch this space for that, but thank you for the interest in that. And as we missed yesterday's lesson, will we still be able to do it? Yes. We will be making up the missed session either later this week or next week. So we'll let you know when that is, but this is part 1, and then part 2 and 3, etc. will be following each day. Let's have a look. Someone asked, Vicki, is there an acrostic for this, like proud smile?
Yeah, so I used proud smile last week, so I do have a rubbish one. So I used stop Fez, which is a nice little acrostic, but it is a bit rubbish because there are so many letters that are difficult to get into words easily. So that's what I use, but again, not exclusive. So you can use those, although it is so rubbish that my students do tend to remember it, so perhaps it's a good thing. Right, revision books for English, good question. Now, English language, what have I got? I don't think I do have one textbook which is quite good, but for the life of me, I'm not sure where it is. In terms of literature, I think York Notes are really good. So I definitely do recommend those. Here we go. This is quite a nice combined one. So this is for AQA. So AQA GCSE English Language and English Literature course student book, and it's a nice little textbook. I can't remember how much it was. I don't think it was more than like £22, but it is good, and it covers loads of different things from language techniques and literature techniques for both their exams. So English Literature York Notes is really good. So I think they have pretty much one for every text that is potentially on the syllabus for you to cover. So those are pretty cracking if you want something for literature. Right, what do you mean by part 1 or 2? Oh, right, was part 1 yesterday, part 2 was supposed to be today. So this is part 1, in place of part 2. Part 2 will be tomorrow instead of part 3, and part 3 will be Friday, and part 4 will be coming at you at some point, as Tilly said, but we haven't worked out the logistics of when we're going to do it yet. So you will find out about that, and I'm sure you will get an email. What does embedding quotations look like? Right, so let's flick back to the waggle. So this is embedding quotations, so just carrying on the sentence and effectively just squeezing it in there seamlessly. So choosing to focus on her biology teacher. I wasn't killed by Mr. Bot, by the way. So instead of saying, choosing to focus on her biology teacher. For example, I wasn't killed by Mr. Bot, by the way, so not using for example or this is shown by. You can do that, but it's not as sophisticated as embedding your quotations in AQA. Do love you to embed a quotation, so definitely recommend that. The book is called The Lovely Bones. It says £7.99 on the back. I imagine you can buy it from any relatively large bookstore. If you do want to read it, it's not a set text, but it is quite a nice little interesting read. But it is quite sad, pre-warning. It is sad. So, see if I missed anything else.
There are a couple of people asking earlier if you could just do a quick recap on over the shoulder.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so where are we? Over the shoulder. So over the shoulder, so this is it is a third person narrator, and where you effectively follow a character and you are sort of acting like their shadow. So the best example that I can think of that most of you will probably know about is Harry Potter. So let's see if I can find an example. So it's always following Harry and what Harry is doing, and we make the same mistakes as Harry. So for example, if he thinks Voldemort's doing something and he actually isn't. So for example, in the fifth one, where he thinks Sirius Black is being held captive at the Department of Mysteries, he actually isn't, but we make that mistake that Harry makes. So for example, this is an extract from number 6, Half-Blood Prince. So Harry spent a lot of the last week of the holidays pondering the meaning of Malfoy's behaviour in Nocturne Alley. So we're following what Harry's thinking, what Harry's doing, and sort of what he thinks of that. So what disturbed him most was the satisfied look on Malfoy's face as he had left the shop. So we're sort of thinking about what Harry's doing specifically, and it's what we know and see is what Harry sees. So for example, in the 7th one, I've just reread them, so this is why I'm so buffed up on it. So when Hagrid is carried away by spiders in the 7th one, we make the assumption that Hagrid is probably dead because that's what Harry assumes. So it's basically third person. It's not I thought this, but you tend to make the same mistakes as the protagonist or the antagonist does that you are following. Hopefully that clears that up. Revision book. Okay, I'll quickly tell you what that is again. So I don't think this is actually a revision book as such, but there are activities for you to have a go. It's more textbooky, it's quite thick. AQA, GCSE, English Language and English Literature core student book. So they are, I think this is a really cracking book. It's got examples of responses. Thank you to the person who said Oxford OCR for English Language is really good. Yeah, so if you are doing OCR, that would be good. Recommended websites for English language revision for free. Right, so definitely BBC Bite Size. There is a site called TES, so TES, which is the Times Educational Supplement, where teachers put up resources, some for paid, some for free. So I've made revision resources that are up on there. So I've made a Blood Brothers intervention and revision booklet, which is up there for free, and Jekyll and Hyde intervention and revision booklets. So those are up there, and there's loads of really good stuff on there in terms of revision. That they're aimed at teachers for teachers to teach, but I'm sure you will find some revision stuff which is helpful on there. Right.
Brilliant, thanks Vicky. I think maybe we'll wrap up there. Yeah, perfectly on time. Thanks for all those questions, guys, and any help you gave there. And hopefully that was a really useful tutorial for you. Thanks very much, Vicky, for today's tutorial. That was brilliant. Hopefully see lots of you guys for the second part of this series, which will be tomorrow at 11 a.m. And also we have some other tutorials running today if you're interested in other subjects. We've got maths in 15 minutes, we've got physics at 2, and we've got our first history session at 3:15 as well, which might interest some of you who want to do some humanities revision. So if you want to attend any of those, the link is on site as usual. If not, have a lovely afternoon, and we'll be seeing you hopefully tomorrow. So thanks guys, and see you soon.
Thank you, bye.